Hey everyone, Solaris here again. I actually meant to do this video second. I meant to do this video first, but I ended up publishing, the Hyper-V video first. So my apologies for that. But basically, in this one, we're actually going to be covering installing a server operating system. And like I mentioned previously, this entire series is going to be based off of Windows Server. So we're going to be starting with that. I also generally Pixie boot or use WDS to transfer my installation via Ethernet or the network. But right now we're actually inside IPMI right now. And we're going to destroy and create the RAID arrays that we're going to be using since, I got my SSDs in and installed them. So without further ado, let's just get started. So first things first, you got your machine together, you want to install an operating system. We got to create those RAID arrays that we were talking about in the Hyper-V video, just so that we have a bit of a foundation to work with. Again, I'm going to be streaming the ISO for server 2019 technical preview via IPMI. So it might be a bit slower than Pixie, but we'll see how it goes, and I'll trim it if necessary. But let's see what we got going on here. If we go over to the Intel RSTE SATA controller, we can see that I have a data and a Hyper-V array. We're just going to destroy both of them, just so you can kind of see the process. And you'll also be able to control some of this through the RSTE once it's installed in the actual host OS. But for right now, we're not really going to be touching that. We're just going to do it in BIOS, and then we'll get into that later. So we'll go ahead and create RAID volume, and we will name this one data. And we're going to pick 0. Again, like I said, it's better to have redundancy and speed, but I'm purposely picking 0 because this isn't the fastest machine. And it'll help in the long run, and honestly, I don't care if I lose anything. On my production system, I have a NAS that backs up everything, and I, do all the server backups, so that is something to consider. We're just going to select both the hard drives, and just the hard drives for the data array, because those are the only 2 disks that I want to be part of it, which would give me roughly about a terabyte of space between the 2 500 gig drives. Next, I'm actually going to create the Hyper-V array, and this one is going to be made up of 2 solid-state drives. My 850 EVO 120s, which doesn't seem like a lot of space, but it's just a lab PC. So we'll go ahead and create that array. And the last one is going to be some random Silicon Power SSD that I had lying around. It's nothing special, but that one is different and not going to be part of an array because that's actually going to be our OS disk. So with that all done and those arrays created, now we're just going to go ahead and save and exit. Obviously, if you happen to be in here, and I'll include this in the actual build video, make sure that virtualization and things like that are enabled. So we'll go ahead and save, and now we are going to see if we can install Windows Server, and we'll see how long it takes and whether or not I have to pause the video. But I just want to walk you guys through, the initial install because I believe that it's important, and I don't want you to think that it's scary, especially if you've done something like, install a consumer OS. In my opinion, I actually think that installing consumer OS is more difficult. I think that the server operating systems generally don't have as many windows and screens that you need to interface with, so it goes a bit quicker. And I'll leave links as to where to download the trials and stuff, because this entire series and project is going to be based off of the Microsoft trials, and those are easily obtainable. So I'll definitely leave links for that so that you guys can download it. And we are actually the virtual CD-ROM via IPMI here. And it looks like it sees it as a disk, and it's loading stuff, and it doesn't appear to be going too terribly slow, which is good. I thought there'd be more overhead being over IPMI versus WDS, but it apparently seems to be chugging right along. So in this series, we're going to be doing Windows with the GUI. And for those that don't know, there are two different types. You have Windows Server Core, which is just Hyper-V, and then you have Windows Server, with the GUI. And then of course you have your different editions, because Windows Server has different editions, just like, Windows has Home and Pro. We're going to be using the GUI, and we're going to be using Data Center Edition so that we can get into the more complex things. So we're going to go ahead and hit next here. English, US, yeah, that's where I am. And then hit install now. And now we should be able to pick our arrays and disks. So we'll let that think about it. We'll be using a key later. So we'll just hit, I don't have one right now. Okay, so this is what I was talking about. You're going to have standard and data center, and then, the core of each. And that's what it means by desktop experience. Desktop experience gives you the GUI, and the core edition has no GUI. It is literally just a PowerShell prompt when you log in. It's incredibly light on resources, but for simplicity's sake for teaching, we're going to go ahead and use the GUI. So I will choose Data Center with the desktop experience. And of course we all know that, we've all read that, right? So we'll hit custom, and now we get to do a bunch of stuff here. So let's see. We need to, it looks like my OS disk was not wiped. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll just go ahead and delete that, because there's no way to do that through the BIOS, because the RAID utility, RSTE, lets you destroy any data on the disk when you're making a RAID array. But since this disk wasn't part of a RAID array, then nothing got destroyed on it. As you can see, drive 1 is about 1 terabyte. That's our Western Digital array, and then drive 2 is about 212 gigs, and that is our 120 gig dual SSD array. So this one, drive 0 here, is going to be somewhere around 120 gigs, and this is our 120 gig host drive. So we're just going to delete all these partitions here. If you're using brand new disks, you're going to get something that looks a lot like this instead of what I just did. You're going to have your drives listed and the capacities. I happen to know that this one is my primary disk, my 120 gig Silicon Power SSD. So we're going to go ahead and install to that one. And hopefully it moves right along here. I'll pause it if it becomes too long, but basically what's going to happen now is, now that I've selected my target disk, Windows is going to format the drive for me. I don't need to do it, and then it's going to copy all of the files over to that drive, set up the MBR or the EFI partition if I'm installing this in UEFI mode, which I am. And then it's going to restart the server and attempt to boot off of the drive, and then we'll go into actual OOBE, which is the out-of-box experience, and configure things like username and password, etc. So at this point it looks like it might take it a second, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the video here, and we're going to pick up when this is complete. Hey everyone, so we're back. It just got done installing and copying all those files over from the ISO, and now the server is actually rebooting. So I'm actually going to go into my IPMI interface here, and I'm actually going to plug out that disk and then hit OK. So we don't have that connected anymore. Now it's going to attempt to boot off of the OS, and we should see that here after it's done initializing everything. Sometimes server boots, especially Lenovo, take forever. Supermicro isn't too bad, but if you're using proper server components, you definitely might notice that some boot ups tend to be a bit longer, and it really is nothing to worry about. They're just more components that it needs to start up. So, really soon here, we're going to pop into our actual OOBE, and I will demonstrate, quick how to go through this, and then then we'll dive into some of the immediate best practices for, getting your server ready for usage. Most of which is pretty much do your Windows updates, almost immediately. Pick a proper name for your server, and set like a static IP. And we'll get into that. I won't necessarily outline it right here, but let's get through OOB first, and then we can dive right into that. And I'll kind of like go into like why, while we're doing it. So it finished starting the services and doing the rest of the installation that it needed to do and restarted. Generally, this is the point where like OOBE will like begin after it finishes its last like initial boot. So we should be able to dive right in here in just a second. Sometimes, I forgot what I was going to say, but anyway, so the default user when you're installing a consumer OS, the consumer editions, you're allowed to pick your own username, etc. Windows Server, it's always administrator. Like the administrator account that does exist in the consumer versions is enabled by default on Windows Server, and it wants you to set a password. You are going to want to make sure that this is a very strong password. This password is, the root of everything. It can control everything. It is what would it enables access to your machine. What can I say? Like, you can log into the local machine using this password. You're going to want to make it strong. There are going to be tools and configurations and software that are based off of this account, or possibly could be in the future, and you're just going to want to make sure that no one can break in. So do not make this simple. For our intents and purposes, we're going to make it like kind of simple, because it's just like a test password. But I will also leave a link on good password policies and practices in the description. That way you guys can see, or get an idea of things that maybe you should do, personally with your own accounts, and specifically for the server here. So as you can see, that was pretty much it. That's literally what I was talking about earlier. That's all you have to do. You enter your password and you are done. Now we hit Control-Alt-Delete and we log into it. Now RDP obviously isn't enabled by default, so I'm going to do that via my KVM. Then after we log in, it's going to do what normal consumer OSs do, and it'll get our desktop ready or whatever, which may or may not take a few minutes depending on the speed of the machine. But for servers, it's relatively quick. So as you can see, we are popped right into it. So one thing that you may want to do, and I'll show you how really quick, is by default, when you have a server operating system and you log into it, the server manager opens up immediately. Sometimes you just want to access the tools that are on the desktop, and this can just be like a really minor annoyance. You can actually adjust that. So if we go up to Manage right here in the top corner, we click on that and we hit Server Manager Properties. We can set Do Not Start Server Manager automatically at login, and we'll just hit OK. And now when we log into the machine, it isn't going to pop up. However, this is a user-specific setting. So if you create another user account, you are going to need to enable that all over again. So now what we're going to do, here's where we start diving into the best practices. First and foremost, you are going to want to set a static IP for your primary Ethernet, right? So we know through our last video, Ethernet 2 isn't the one that I'm going to necessarily want to do. We can double check here though by opening up our properties manager. and we're just going to check. And in this case it is. It looks like I reversed it, which is a shame, but that's okay. I guess it doesn't really matter. So for our primary Ethernet, the first thing that you're really going to want to do is you need to set a static IP address. I happen to know what I'm going to be setting mine at, but you might need to look into that to see what kind of naming convention you use and what IPs are available, and what your DHCP scope is. And we can get a little bit into that later in the networking segments. Pretty much you just want to make this something that isn't going to be automatically assigned by your router to any other device, and you don't want it to be something that is already taken by another device on your network. So to get there, specifically in server 2019, 2016, and maybe not 2012, right click on your Ethernet and open network and internet settings, and then change adapter properties. There are a bunch of different ways to get here. You can use the run command, you can manually find it in control panel, like whatever floats your boat. You just want to get to network connections so you can see the physical adapters. We're going to select one of our interfaces. We're going to right click and go to properties, and then we are going to click on IPv4, because that's primarily what your router at home is probably giving you, and we're going to click properties on that. And from here we're allowed to set our DNS and our server settings. So go ahead and use the following IP address, which will switch it to manual mode, and we'll enter the things that we want to do. So my internet scheme is 10. That's my IP scheme. Yours is probably 192.168. And that's still totally fine. I happen to know that my net mask is this. My gateway is that. I believe my DNS server is .19. After you type all of that in, you can go ahead and hit OK. For the DNS server, that can also be like a public one, like Google or what have you. So just go ahead and pick whatever DNS server you really want. It's only really important that the other information is super correct. Your DNS server, you can make your router, which would be generally the same as your gateway. Or if you have a separate DNS server on your network, you would make it that IP address. Or if you just want to use an open one like Google or Quad9 or Cloudflare, you would set it to that, and then you just hit OK. So now that we're out of it, we've done what we're supposed to. We have set our static IP. Okay, so now what we got to do is, ideally, you are going to want to correct your date and time. I happen to be on the East Coast, so we're just going to hit change time zone. I'm going to find Eastern time, and then internet time. I honestly don't use the Windows servers. I use NIST because I find that the Windows servers are less accurate in that they have infrastructure issues where like the delta and like the sync time is way off base, and it really messes up the clocks. That actually happened in 2017, and it ruined a lot of people's day. With that said, it's an affirmation that you want to do this. You want to set the proper time zone. You want to sync the time. A lot of things run based on time, and you are going to want your time right all the time. So make sure you do that. So now that our time is correct and synced, we can see here that it's also changed to 10.0.0.9. Now what we're going to do is the next step is enable RDP, so it's a bit easier for us to get inside the machine. And this is going to change, this is going to enable the ports. This is just a warning telling us that it's going to change the ports that RDP needs in the Windows firewall, and we're just going to go ahead and let that happen. And then we want this checkbox. This is an LA. This means that you have to log into the machine. It's important to have. You're going to want it. So go ahead and hit apply. It's also important to note that if you get to the point where you want to RDP from like home, that's something that we'll probably cover later. But do not expose the port for RDP to the internet. Don't do it. RDP is a very dumb protocol. It doesn't have lockouts. There is no limit to the amount of times that you can enter a password incorrectly. And like you saw during the installation, administrator is the base user account. So with that said, people can literally attack your server. You know, there are scanners going all the time, and even bots just firing off randomly, attempting to log into people's servers because they expose RDP to the internet. I don't have RDP exposed to the internet, and I can only access RDP on machines that are on my LAN, and that's something that you're going to want to do. If you don't know whether or not yours is exposed to the internet, you can check your manual, but thankfully most consumer grade routers, you know, it is disabled and RDP is not exposed to the internet. So just make sure that's something to consider, something to look into if you're unsure or you feel like doing it because you know how. I don't recommend it. Don't do that. Ideally, what you would do is you would VPN to what's called a jump box, which is either a physical machine or a virtual machine that you make that is exposed to the internet, not via RDP, but through VPN. And you would VPN into that machine and then RDP to another machine in your network so that the RDP port is never exposed to the internet. So with that said though, we have fixed our time. We have set static IP. We have configured RDP. And now the last thing that we're going to want to do before we're all set and ready to go here is we're going to want to change our computer name. This is important. You don't make it something that you're going to know, and make it something that makes sense. Especially if a server becomes part of a domain in the future, this is not really something that you are going to want to change later. It becomes more difficult, so you want to plan this in advance. In my particular case, I can keep it a simple name. We're just going to call it TDE Lab. You can name your something like Lab Server, just so that you can identify it through the network. And I know that this isn't going to change. I also know that it's my lab machine, so I'll just pretty much destroy it whenever I want. But it's good practice, and you're going to want to do that because, like I said, if this server is ever part of a bigger network, or you ever have it, in Active Directory or something like that, and you change the name, it is going to make a lot of things very unhappy. And it is difficult for beginners to pull back from a server name change if it's part of directory services. So just make sure that you put some thought into it before you commit it. With that said, mine's changed. It's going to ask you to restart. We've done everything else, so I'm going to go ahead and restart now. That's pretty much all I really wanted to get through today, was just a basic Windows Server installation. There really is nothing to it. Just make sure that your passwords are strong, and make sure that you set your time. Enable RDP so you can manage it from your laptop or your desktop, somewhere else. That way you're not using it all the time in front of it, because that's super annoying sometimes. Set a static IP address so that you can RDP into it pretty frequently, and you always know it. It makes it simpler to manage from a networking perspective, and set your server name to something that makes sense. So like I said, I'll drop some of those links into the description so that you can get some further reading. And I really hope that you guys, think that this was useful. Again, leave me some constructive criticism or questions, comments, if you have any questions on anything, and I'll try to get back to you. Thank you, and have a good one.